Thank you so much for inviting me to the Wharton People Analytics Conference. I'm thrilled to be here and share some of my work with you all, the brightest folks working at the intersection of people and data. So very, very broadly, I am interested in interacting and understanding and predicting the future of work. Most of the specific research questions that I work on focus on examining how we can effectively leverage novel technologies for creating positive impact. So when I began venturing into this area, I acknowledged two realities. The first one, there is a very rapid proliferation of new technologies, both in our organizations and in our society. And the second is if we're not thoughtful about understanding how these novel technologies are going to impact us as people psychologically, we will have to face serious challenges at the people-technology intersection. Challenges that all of us in the audience here are actually very familiar with. Things like data privacy and the ethical use of data, inequality in modern organizations, deep systemic issues that get further baked into new technologies, and so forth. So acknowledging these two realities brought me to explore how we can enhance our understanding of the psychology of new technologies and then utilize this knowledge to effectively leverage novel technologies in our organizations and in our society. So today, I'm going to provide a very, very high-level overview of my research in three areas that actually correspond to three top technological trends in recent times. The first one is behavior tracking technologies. The second is virtual reality. And the third is artificial intelligence. The common theme that you're going to notice is this focus on understanding the psychology of what happens when people interact with these technologies. Hopefully, this is going to provide us with at least a little bit of insight into the why behind how these technologies will impact us, and then hopefully offer us some practical insights into how we can effectively use these technologies in our organizations. Okay, let's dive right in. The rapid proliferation of behavior tracking technologies is actually undisputed. Now think about all of the devices and applications that you've purchased on your own, or maybe your organizations have given you, that can track your behaviors continuously and provide sort of like this full picture of who you are. Reports indicated that worldwide spending on behavior tracking devices actually went up from $13.9 billion in 2017 to over $62 billion in 2020. The pandemic, and of course, all of us working from home, has only accelerated this trend. Now, I'm going to show you something else as well. Surprisingly, this data also suggests that 3 out of 5 people were actually willing to accept behavior tracking devices in their workplaces. Here's another statistic. While only 10% of people were okay with their employers having access to data related to their personal activities, just about 6 years ago, 2015, this number actually went up to 30% in 2018 and went up to even 50% if employers were okay to be transparent about the purpose of tracking. Now, this whole phenomenon was just fascinating to me. And then I set out to examine what was driving people's newfound willingness to accept technological tracking. Let's just stop and think about this for a second. If our partners came in every hour, asked us to breathe or sit up straight, that would be quite annoying, right? But that's exactly what our behavior tracking products do, and we're okay with it. We might even like it, and we oblige. So in this research, we began examining how this technological tracking that was fully automated was psychologically different from tracking that had some form of human involvement. Now, please note that in this whole research, whenever I'm talking about human tracking, I'm referring to technological tracking with very limited human involvement. For example, humans just performing things like data analysis or providing feedback and so forth. So in this research, we found some really cool things. The first thing was technological tracking was actually experienced as informational, and tracking that had any form of human involvement, even in the very, very limited ways that I've suggested, was experienced as evaluative. So how did this happen? What happened was technological tracking through behavior tracking products eliminated the salience of humans in this tracking process. And in doing so, it actually allowed people to get feedback about their own behaviors without feeling concerned about potential negative judgment. So then people started experiencing this whole tracking context as just informational, not as something that was controlling, not as something that was evaluative. So essentially, then the psychology that was driving people's behavior tracking acceptance was that technological tracking, relative to human tracking in the very limited ways that I suggested, of course, was actually leading to lower concerns about potential negative judgment, and as a result, led to increased subjective sense of autonomy, and ultimately, this increased willingness to accept tracking. So I want to give you sort of this overview of this research at a very, very high level. So in this research, we conducted a number of experiments with a diverse sample of 3,500 people, employed adults, MBAs, undergraduates, adults over the age of 55, and so forth. We examined these effects in the work context, and what was really cool was to see that this willingness to accept technological tracking persisted regardless of a number of things. First of all, it persisted regardless of the type of behaviors being tracked, whether we were tracking work-related behaviors or personal activities. It persisted regardless of the human tracking these behaviors, whether this person was a stranger or a coworker. And it persisted regardless of the purpose of tracking. If the organization was going to track you just to provide you feedback for your own improvement, or if the organization was actually tracking you to make HR decisions like hiring, firing, and so forth. So I'm going to very briefly show you data from the experiment where we manipulated the purpose of tracking. So here in the slide, the orange bars represent technological tracking. The gray bars represent tracking with some sort of human involvement. On the left, you'll notice the results for when we said that the organization will be tracking you and using your data only to provide feedback to you about your own behaviors. You can see that people showed an increased preference or increased willingness to accept technological tracking. On the right, we said that the organization will be tracking you and your data will be used to make HR decisions. And people once again showed a preference for technological tracking, even when they knew that the data would be used for making HR decisions. And of course, across our slide experiments, we also examined the psychological processes driving this effect. And as I had indicated earlier, we found that concerns about potential negative judgment and the subjective sense of autonomy were key drivers here. So what are the takeaways? The first thing that we need to remember when we think about tracking is if we can reduce human involvement in tracking and entrust our employees with their own tracking data, then we can make tracking an informational experience rather than an evaluative experience. Now, this has important implications for employee motivation. So in our research, we also found that technological tracking and experiencing this tracking context as informational led to greater intrinsic motivation relative to human tracking. And if the whole purpose of tracking your employees is to motivate people to behave in certain ways, then our research suggests that eliminating the human involvement in tracking and kind of taking away this big brother feeling is actually going to be key. So as organizational leaders, it is important for us to start reframing how we think about tracking. The key question that we want to start asking is, how can I use these new behavior tracking technologies to enhance informational outcomes for my employees, rather than asking, how can I use these new tracking technologies to keep monitoring my employees more? And of course, this has numerous implications for things like privacy and the ethical use of data by organizations, especially given how open employees are nowadays to technological tracking. It will be up to you as organizational leaders to make conscious and ethical decisions about how you want to start responsibly handling your employees' personal data, especially when they're so open to sharing it with you. Okay, the next big technological trend I'll be talking about is virtual reality. I hope you all saw the amazing splash that Microsoft made with Microsoft Mesh, the virtual and augmented reality demo recently. It was so cool. In fact, recent reports suggested that worldwide investments in VR went up from around 13.9 billion to over 143 billion in 2020. There's no doubt that this is one of the top technological investments that organizations are making today. Similar to behavior tracking products, Of course, a majority of employees, about 66%, were willing to use VR and AR for work. This number probably has gone up even more when we think about the pandemic and how we're all now more used to using new technologies for work. So in this research, my co-authors and I began exploring the potential use of VR for managing employees. Specifically, we were examining when and why managers might prefer to lead through avatars as opposed to via face-to-face interactions. Well, I'm going to do a short side note here. That is an avatar of me that was created at the USC Institute for Creative Technologies in a day. So they took a picture, and then the next day I received this avatar in an email. So that's how easy it is for us to create avatars of ourselves these days. Now, when and why would managers prefer interacting via avatars? We examined this question in the context of frequent monitoring in order to start highlighting that certain managerial situations might actually trigger psychological discomfort for managers. Now, in those situations, managers have concerns about being judged negatively by others, especially their subordinates. And this can lead to what we're calling defensive distancing. Maybe some sort of avoidant behaviors due to either being unable or untrained to handle these difficult psychological situations. We noticed that in those situations, managers would turn to technologies to start sidestepping this potential negative judgment. Now, in the context of virtual reality and technologies like the Microsoft Mesh that you just saw, it is possible to interact via avatars and mitigate social risks because of the reduced social presence, and actually be able to get some sort of psychological distance without feeling very distant from your employees themselves. So let me show you some data from this research, and then I would also want to highlight the psychology behind some of these findings in the next couple of slides. Here, the orange bars represent frequent monitoring, and the gray bars represent the infrequent monitoring. Both when we ask people to make a choice on a dichotomous measure and when we ask people to indicate their preference for avatars in a continuous measure, participants in our experiments showed a greater preference for interacting via avatars when they had to engage in frequent monitoring, a potentially uncomfortable psychological situation for them. Now, we also found that participants, when asked to engage in frequent monitoring, reported feeling psychologically uncomfortable, feeling concerned about potentially being judged negatively, especially by their subordinates. And what was interesting was that this concern about potential negative judgment actually drove their preference for interacting via avatars rather than face-to-face when they had to engage in frequent monitoring. Now, we examined when and why people might prefer interacting via avatars over face-to-face interactions, and we focused on managers and bounded the context to uncomfortable situations. However, there is a larger takeaway here. Technologies such as virtual reality can actually allow us to have interactions in a psychologically safe manner. This is important to consider for a number of reasons. So, as I highlighted at the beginning, organizations are investing in VR and they're investing heavily. But these investments are predominantly made with the thought that it's going to improve collaboration, which is true and which is great. However, that is not the only use for these types of technologies. VR can actually be used to enhance psychological safety. It can be used to improve employees' experiences when it comes to potentially uncomfortable interpersonal situations. For example, think about the use of these technologies for things like interviews, bias trainings, for allowing employees a psychologically safe environment to speak up to leaders more, to be more authentic and less uncomfortable and feel more psychologically safe. So when we think about VR, collaboration is great. We're going to keep using these devices for these types of collaborative processes, but we also can leverage them for enhancing psychological safety within our organizations. The last big technological trend we'll talk about today is artificial intelligence. This is not going to come as a surprise to anybody here. We all know that investments in AI have skyrocketed in recent years. Reports suggest that it is expected to go up from about 50 billion in 2020 to over 110 billion in 2024, likely even more. Now, We talk about AI in the workforce and how it can potentially replace humans in even very high-skilled professions. In fact, a recent survey of HBS alums reported that 52% of companies will actually employ fewer workers in the next few years. There is a lot of ongoing research on how AI will impact the workforce of the future. In my research, I'm going to focus on another angle that fits with this broader theme that we talked about at the beginning. How can we effectively use AI to create positive impact? So specifically in this research, I examined how AI can be used for social support. Now, in this picture here, you're seeing Ellie. Ellie is an AI-driven virtual therapist who's actually at the USC Institute for Creative Technologies. And Ellie has already been used in a number of research studies to offer social support for various populations, including veterans and students and people who would like to confide in somebody. And this is a technology that is currently present and is absolutely not science fiction. I've seen Ellie work. So just highlighting that AI can already be used for social support, the focus of the current research is to understand whether AI can be actually an effective form of social support. And if yes, then do we as people recognize AI as an effective form of social support? So in this research, across a number of studies, we have two really very intriguing findings. The first one is AI support relative to human support actually makes people feel better. It leads to lower feelings of anxiety, lower feelings of stress, lower feelings of negative well-being. And this is all driven by lower fear of negative judgment relative to human support. The second intriguing finding is despite it actually making us feel better, we perceive AI support as less effective relative to human support. And this is driven by perceiving AI as having lower empathy. So I'm going to go a little bit into some of these results and sort of unpack them for us. We found these effects across a number of experiments with a very diverse sample of over 3,000 adults, university employees, working adults, students, and so forth. And then we also tested these effects in this context of instability in the workplace, and we explored both why AI might be a better source of social support in certain situations and why there is a gap in how we experience versus perceive AI support relative to human support. So let me show you some data from our experiments. The orange bars here represent AI support, and the gray bars here represent human support. On the left, you can see that people are experiencing lower levels of stress, lower levels of anxiety, and negative well-being after getting AI support relative to human support. Moreover, people also report having lower fear of negative judgment when experiencing AI support. Now, I don't show the mediation results here, but this lower fear of negative judgment is what's leading to these better affective outcomes. On the right, however, you're seeing that people actually perceive AI support as less effective and less empathetic. And this perception of lower empathy actually drives these perceived effectiveness effects. So the bottom line is this: we feel better with AI support relative to human support, but think that human support is actually more effective. So let me just highlight some of the big implications for organizations and how organizations might actually start to leverage AI to offer support in a psychologically safe manner for employees. This is especially important when employees want to discuss sensitive matters. Now, AI support allows employees to do so without any fear of negative judgment. It actually makes them feel better, and investing in this form of support can have positive implications for employee well-being. The flip side, however, is that we must, as a society, start considering what this means and what this does for our social needs, especially our need to connect with other people. We'll want to think about how to balance providing social support in a psychologically safe manner, especially in organizations. And then we also need to think about ensuring that our people don't become averse to connecting with others, real humans, in our organizations. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. And before I close, I would like to thank my collaborators on these different projects. Nate Fast, my advisor from graduate school, Peter Carnevale, both of them at the University of Southern California, the Marshall School, Trevor Ford, one of my friends at the University of Maryland. And as I close, I'd like to leave us with a little something to reflect on. New technologies are going to keep proliferating our organizations. Let's always pause and think about the human implications of introducing these technologies. Understanding these human implications can actually allow us to effectively leverage these new technologies for creating positive impact. Thank you.